Good morning. Welcome to Leading Change Amid Disruption. I'm Chris Bruhl.
And I'm Canny. It's wonderful to have you with us today.
This is the first of a series of 4 webinars addressing higher education's current challenges and opportunities. We're recording the presentation and we'll make it available next week. Thank you, as Eric said, for joining us. Our 3 core premises today for this session are that we have entered a multi-year period of disruption. Institutional culture will be a prime determinant of success in our responses to the impacts we are experiencing, and that culture change may be required to move forward effectively. Let's begin with the big picture. Culture is both foundational and malleable. It's not just inherited and inevitable. Collectively, we make it. Individually, our behavior is shaped by it. Leaders can embrace the existing culture, adopting a style that fits the context, or they can make the choice to intentionally shape culture in ways that make the institutions more resilient as it experiences change. The key word here is not change, that's a constant, it's choice. Participating today suggests that you have made that choice. This session is intended to help you learn how to define culture and to understand your own, how to identify and analyze the disruptions your institution is facing, how to differentiate between quick wins, we need them and we want them, and longer-term interventions that assure that our culture supports rather than impedes change. How to map your culture's strengths and gaps, and to update our expectations of each other in these special times as teammates. And importantly, how to work collaboratively to design and be guided by a formal accountability process. Let's dive in. Eric?
Thank you, Chris. And so wanted to also just ground why we're focusing on culture at this moment. Culture is either an organizational accelerant or it could also be a drag chute. When it functions as an asset, it propels strategy, speeds decision-making, attracts talent. When it becomes a gap or a drag chute, every new initiative must fight headwinds of unspoken habits and stories. And so that's why we're zeroing in on culture now. In a moment when disruption is relentless, the hidden rules of how we do things here can make or break our ability to adapt in real time or close to it. So what exactly is organizational culture? We're going to talk about a few more slides, but you won't find it in a policy book. One of my favorite descriptions is from the researchers Clark and Estes, who describe it as a fog. Just like a fog, it is everywhere. We know that it's everywhere, but it's hard to actually say, how do we actually capture it? How do we find these points where it touches things? And so for me, culture is a fog. It hides in plain sight, surfacing in how people act when no one is looking, in the assumptions that they have never bothered to explain, and in the shorthand rituals that signal belonging, either within your institution or the department. These shared assumptions, values, and behaviors silently dictate how work flows, who speaks up, and which ideas survive. This is where we can spot culture's fingerprints everywhere, is when it starts to touch things, such as weekly stand-ups, inside jokes, and origin stories that reinforce the way things get done. Even the office layout broadcasts values. Is collaboration favored, or is status marked by office corners? All of this shapes how we decide, collaborate, gamble on risk, and rank priorities, all of which we are doing right now. And that's why 2 organizations with identical missions can operate worlds apart, because their cultures chart different pathways to the same goal. If you want culture to help rather than hinder, we have to look straight at it. Start with like a quick audit. Questions on a single dimension, trust or innovation, can expose friction in just a few days. Then you start mapping the daily rituals, tools, and symbols, and reinforce the stated values, which currently erode those actions. One of my favorite sort of visuals and way of thinking about organizational culture is Edgar Schein's cultural framework. You see it here on the screen. Why a pyramid? And this is why it makes sense to me. Edgar Schein uses the pyramid to remind us that culture is layered. What's visible sits at the top, and the deeper you dig, the more permanent change becomes. At the tip, those things that we can see are artifacts, the dress code, org charts, maybe the emojis that get used. and onboarding checklists. All of these things, an outsider could walk in and be able to see them. We can redesign these quickly, yet any shift here is fleeting unless it is anchored in the layers below. The mid-tier houses espoused values. These could be mission statements, pledges. Are we a customer-first slogan? How do we think of students? These ideals point teams in a particular direction, but they're only as powerful as the system that reinforces them, above and below. A mismatch between stated values, policies, process, maybe even rewards or resources can create cultural whiplash. And then at the base is the underlying assumptions, the unspoken beliefs about how things really work, such as is risk punished or managers must approve anything and everything. Because these assumptions operate below conscious awareness, they're the toughest to surface and the stickiest to transform. Yet once they shift, the new culture is on its way to becoming accepted. And I just want to call out the arrows on the side. On the left side, at the top, like I've discussed, changing artifacts is easy. Getting down to the underlying assumptions, difficult. The right side reinforces also the durability of that change. Chris, we are back to you.
Well, Eric, with the help of Edgar Schein, he defined culture. So let's look at disruption. Brief word of reminder. Disruption occurs when an organization experiences significant changes that affect its resources, disturb existing patterns of behavior, require coordination among individuals and groups, alter our workload, and perhaps our own performances. So we have a simple definition that sums all that up at the top of this slide. Most simply, disruption is the result of the interaction of the impacts of change and the misalignment between how we've always done things and what we must do now. It can result from an opportunity, a $20 million bequest to a school without an endowment, or from an obstacle, visa constraints cutting international student enrollment. The response to these opportunities, these changes, these impacts, is going to be largely determined by how we start out misaligned and then realign to move from how we've always done things to what we must do now. Well, higher education has certainly been experiencing waves of change. Four are shown here. We won't go into depth because we all know what they are, but society is questioning our value. Gender enrollment and achievement imbalances continue and are accelerating. We're in the age of algorithms and AI, and explosively so moving into AI. And we have competition in meeting evolving workforce needs. So 2025 has certainly seen a cascade with impacts that go beyond the minor or just irritation. A series of external shocks, that would certainly be public policy. Again, we all know what they are. It's the reversals on DEI, Title IX, visas, visa policy, student loans, capped indirect costs, a wide range of budget cuts. So we know these external shocks are there. And I would add technology to that as well. With the 1990s to 2010, roughly, we all went through and are continuing to live with the impacts of the internet and social media. And in many ways, we really not have fully aligned our institutions with these impacts, with these disruptions. Now we're experiencing the explosive emergence of generative AI. While external shocks have been attracting much of our attention, internal shifts are underway as well, of course. Leadership is turning over at an accelerating pace, not just presidents, which have an increasingly short tenure, but senior leaders throughout our institutions. The adjunctivization of instruction continues and will, one would assume, might move at an even more rapid rate given the financial and enrollment uncertainty we're facing now. And of course, there's been the rapid and uneven adoption of AI in teaching, often without a plan or really a support system. And then we face social pressures. Faculty and staff are really demanding and in fact may well need hybrid or flexible work. They are seeking financial security in a time of uncertainty. At the same time, inclusion initiatives are facing backlash. We've got tension between many of the values in our communities and national narratives. And the erratic announcements and policy pivots in Washington further destabilize budgets, impact morale, and of course, do legitimately threaten employment. So these trends and events have created high stakes operating hurdles. And we have those there: financial instability, compliance volatility. When the rules change on a regular basis, compliance becomes a very dynamic experience. Reputational risk, investigations, threats of litigation, and of course, talent pressures. How are our people handling all of this? Something that we really need to understand, that this disruption is completely normal. We always have faced disruptions. The disruptions themselves have changed, but we have always faced them. It's our readiness to adapt. It's the having a resilient culture. That's our choice. So when we think about the idea of disruption being normal, and we remind ourselves that the underlying core tension is between how we've always done it and what we must do now, it can feel overwhelming. How can we possibly change fast enough or with significant scope to really move through this disruption into a better or different certainly, and better future? Let's take a look at our next slide for 3 disruptions that kind of will give us a clue here. As much as it would be, having been a former history major, as much as a deep dive into World War II would be truly delightful for me, let's just take a look at peace and demobilization. When peace was achieved, and it was an achievement of many nations, but in particular by the United States, the movement from wartime footing to peace was enormously disruptive. We had a series of booms. We had a baby boom, returning men and women from the service. Housing boom, higher education enrollment boom. Housing and higher ed were generated helped by the GI Bill. The economy shifted back from wartime production to consumer goods. Employers returned to pre-war labor policies, which caused real dissatisfaction among women and minorities who had been pulled into jobs in the workforce because of the departure, primarily of men, into the military, to have opportunities in the economy that they were not permitted to have before the war. And of course, the US was in a time of global dominance. So the profound changes that occurred upon peace and the demobilization continue to ripple through our society today. But how we reacted to it, those disruptions, not the disruptions themselves, how we reacted to them, give us the current structure of our society and many of our political tensions. In 2007, the iPhone, an innovation, a technological innovation, burst on the scene. Think about it, it's only 18 years later. It does feel like the before time was the Renaissance or the Middle Ages, and then there's the iPhone time. Transformation of communication, the app economy, the disruption of commerce, the location-based services, and all the cultural and behavioral shifts. Profoundly smartphone, with the genre created by the iPhone, have been profoundly disruptive. Institutions and individuals have responded in very different manners to them. And then just more recently, the COVID pandemic in 2020 to 2022, that was a surprise. And we had a massive shift to remote and distance among knowledge workers, not among the majority of the workforce whose jobs required them to be physically present, but among the knowledge workers. Dramatic worsening of divides within our existing divides within our society, and an acceleration of political polarization. And higher ed, let's focus on ourselves for a moment, like healthcare, saw immediate and lasting staff stress and staffing shortages. So these were 3 times when always the way we went to war, the way we communicated, phones were for voice, and then out of the blue, the way we related, knowledge workers and knowledge-based enterprises, how work and place interacted, all was transformed in a pivot by surprise. Next slide. So when looking at a change of this magnitude, any of these 3, or the one we're in right now, it's very important to remember this has occurred before. There are best practices that have been developed, for how we respond in times of disruption or to simply one huge disruption, from how we get from how we've always done it to how we really need to do it now. Going back to Eric's opening and critically important observations, culture rests on values. Therefore, our journey to resilience is a value-driven journey. We need to start, scan and sense, first phase, and we need to map it. What are these external or internal impacts of change? How is our culture, designed or functioning, as opposed, it may be simply organically has arisen, but how aligned is it with being able to understand and respond to these disruptions? We need to map that, and we need to identify our gaps. We need to remind ourselves that the mission statement, the strategic plan, the statement of values that have been written potentially now are obsolete. They are potentially remembered the way we might mumble the pledge or a prayer from our youth, but are they actually animating our work now? And if they are they really appropriate for today? So we need to move through a quick but formal process of clarifying our values, re-articulating the guiding principles, and which of these are most appropriate to consider modification or to double down on as being absolutely essential during this time of stress. We need to bring people along on this journey, culture change towards a more resilient culture. So we need to have some quick wins. We need to, it could be as simple as quick stand up if we're in a physical place together, or quick, water cooler webinar, Zoom call, in which we are more frequently sharing the impact and more frequently developing responses to the impact of these external events. Because that will build the habit of communication, the habit of refreshed collegiality around the values that we have clarified, paving the way for more structural shifts should they be necessary. We need to activate our leadership, remembering that leaders can, and there's a whole school of teaching leadership in terms of selecting the style that works best in the environment you're in, situational leadership. When we're talking about the importance of change, we are talking about leaders that are embodying the ability to change, to understand what's happening, to communicate it clearly and simply to others, to role model the behaviors that are required, to coach others, not merely to direct others, to reinforce the positive behaviors, and through a variety of formal and informal mechanisms, discourage the counterproductive past behaviors. And of course, if it matters, we need to and we can measure it, because without measuring, we have no way of really knowing if we're adapting. So we need to develop our own culture metrics. We need to be able to track change as we go. And it can be as basic as, are people showing up for meetings? Are people answering the pulse surveys? And it can also be what they're substantively telling us in those responses and in those meetings. But we want to design our own metrics, and we want to then track them. We want to use them as the occasion for leadership to interpret, for moving from quick wins or quick corrections to structural shifts, to be sure that our values are guiding our behaviors, and to scan and sense continuing disruption. You just heard me repeat. The reason why is that this is an iterative process. We need to repeat this. We're not moving to a finish line. We are in a continuous process, a continuous journey to make sure that our culture is resilient. And as other shocks or shifts occur, we adapt again. We don't merely say we fixed it once. This is a 2025 solution. Well, 2026 or even November, later on this year, change may be necessary again. So we're talking about resilience, not perfection. Eric?
Thank you, Chris. So, Chris actually said 2025 in the resilience template. So what we've done here is sort of taking some of the disruptions that Chris talked about earlier and mapping them into how could we actually take this and align it with culture. And so it's very important, two things. The underlying journey is probably going to be somewhat the same, but because of culture, institutional responses could actually be very different in how they get there. So want to also start, again, we reinforce culture pervades every aspect of every item in the orange box, right? Culture determines how you respond to the first two columns on the left, and then it dictates the outcomes of this response to the right. Just to reinforce what Chris said, at the macro level, we have public skepticism about higher education's value. It's now the default, actually, not the exception. The polarization continues. We actually see both employees and students picking institutions or moving to states that align with their cultural values. The Gen AI is not a bolt-on tool. It's becoming a baseline literacy, right? And so institutions that wait for a proven use case, you actually may be behind the market, not shaping it. And then that leads into sort of the talent competition and preparing for the workforce, right? We're no longer competing with the college across town. We're competing with Google and boot camps and remote first employees. And then we have the enrollment cliff, right? We've been discussing this for a long time, but yet we act as if it's a surprise. And so then, as Chris said, we can map each of these into shocks, shifts, and pressures, right? Internal, external shocks. We're seeing this when the state flips its DEI stance overnight, or Congress alters the indirect cost recovery. All of a sudden, your 5-year plan strategy gets a 24-hour deadline. We have the internal shifts, leadership churn, AI testing. It almost feels like we're in a permanent pilot culture. Everyone is testing and nobody is landing planes. And then the social pressure. What we know is hybrid isn't a perk, even amongst higher ed faculty, staff, and admin. If you deny it, you can actually start to see your retention and your recruitment hurt. We know people will leave an organization today within months if the culture is not aligned to what they were told it was going to be. They used to give us about a year, maybe more. So now we move to culture, right? Artifacts. Again, what are these org charts, the syllabi, classroom layouts, channels, data dashboards, hiring timelines, and even promotion rubrics. These could also be no meeting Fridays, AI labs, hybrid work badges, right? How are these aligned? As Chris said, we need to go back, and it's not about data gathering on all of these. It's about measuring an asset or a gap. Then we move down to espouse values, a mission statement about equity. Is it going to change or not? Innovation. How is everything that's happening with AI going to shift? And student success. How are we actually measuring that, and are we living up to our value? Some other things to consider: faculty first or learner-centered mantras. Is there a stated openness to AI experimentation? Okay. And then we come down to some assumptions, and some of these are pretty ingrained within higher education. Tenure equals worth. Publish or perish. Face-to-face is real teaching. Students are digital natives who can self-navigate. Then it's also important to start looking at these in subcultures. Culture is not a monolith. Every organization has subcultures. And you need to think about how Shine's layers apply to the subcultures. Some good examples: schools within your institution. Then we can go down to the academic departments within the schools. We could look at student services, whether that's all university, housing, or other things, or by school. The administrative units, athletics. Each of these has a very distinct culture and subculture. These then align with your strategic objectives. And from there, you start to develop metrics, financial stability, faculty retention, right? We're seeing all of these being things that we have to respond to today, linked directly back to that macro trends. And so, going back up to the slide, resilience isn't just bouncing back. It's about bouncing forward on purpose. You could actually use this template as a living scorecard. Update the macro view quarterly, stress test culture annually, and report progress on metrics. I would use the word relentlessly. And so sort of go back to why, right? When disruption hits, as it has and probably will continue for a while across higher education, strategy by itself won't save the day. Budget cuts, enrollment cliffs, you name it, are all arriving faster than any strategic plan can adapt. Culture is often, dismissed as a soft concept. It's actually one of my frustrations when I see culture, in some of the public forums and things. But in disruptive times, it actually is your organization's operating system. Back to what Chris was talking and how we live with these disruptions. If we just look at every decade and a half, they come. And so just like, when your operating system is current, disruption becomes a feature upgrade. When it's buggy, every strategy or app crashes. So in these moments, culture decides whether the plan survives or splinter. It's either that cushion that absorbs shocks or that crack that starts to spread under pressure. And I want to focus on four dividends that you get from culture. Strategy execution is actually the first dividend. Strategic execution lives or dies on cultural muscle memory, down to that deeper layer where it may even be unconscious. A beautifully written plan means little if departments don't translate it into everyday acts, their values, how they respond, right? And so it's really important to be thinking about this as a living document, even if we say it's a 4 or 5 year plan. One way to think about this, do our people know how to live the mission when circumstances lurch? Back to values. Real-time change requires real-time reaction. Cultural change is not about a moment in time, but long-term planning for future years. That takes us to resilience. Institutions with healthy, aligned norms to values bounce back from public scrutiny, pandemic pivots, and staffing churns. Fractured cultures, by contrast, break apart faster than leaders can intervene. We know, and this has been shown multiple times, 70% of change efforts fail without intentional leadership. I also want to talk something about intentional leadership. When we're talking about this in the seminar, we're also talking about managers and supervisors. Senior leadership, quote unquote, the C-suite, you will not change culture if those are the only leaders that are considered. Engagement and retention follow the same rule, right? And we know that we have high levels of burnout within our institutions, but we know that faculty, staff, and students stay where their work and identity matter. Back to that polarization. So if your values sit in a PDF that no one revisits, people will actually mentally check out, especially the early career talent who craves purpose and we are trying to retain. Back to looking for gaps between stated values and lived experience. Each gap is a leak in the retention bucket. Each asset can help propel you. Back to innovation. A culture of curiosity and safe failure can quickly pilot micro-credentials, rethink tenure pathways, or overhaul advising. A culture of fear will stall at the first sign of risk. The faster your people can learn out loud, the faster the institution adapts. Back to also having flexible cultures. We know that rigid cultures respond about 30% slower to crises. And so how do we actually, make culture visible and actionable? Some ideas. Publish a monthly culture KPI dashboard. Be public and transparent with your engagement scores, turnover, collaboration, right? Keep this topic data-driven, back to measure. One other thing that I really like, spotlight a values champion each month, staff, faculty, or student, so the community sees the abstract made concrete. Normalize failure postmortems. Treat every pilot or new service as a learning lab. Right? We're in education, and so we actually should be learning from failure in the same way that our students do. Document what worked, what flopped, and what's next. In volatile times, culture is not soft. It's your survival system, one that sustains strategy, people, and progress when external pressure is the highest. So, and both Chris and I have talked about values. So I want to just spend some time doing a little bit deeper dive here. Before any value goes on a poster, it really needs to pass 2 tests, especially today, a private mirror check and then a public proof test. The private mirror check, behind closed doors, ask yourself, which of our values actually drove our recent decisions and which ones felt hollow? Share this maybe with your executive team or others. Sharing these first sets in an authentic tone sets a level of candor upfront that normalizes and legitimizes the conversation as it spreads. Back to what I talked about on the previous slide. Next, you need to invite managers and supervisors in as cultural co-founders. They are not message couriers. Multiple organizational models that we know have a higher chance of success. This is central to them. I've also heard it described as a culture of the willing, right? You need to engage them so that later on they become champions as you continue to evolve. This links somewhat to the public proof test. Convene cross-functional workshops to stress test each value against today's realities. Remote work, funding shocks, tighter compliance. Then you start to capture the gaps where value rings false and the assets where they shine. And I keep sort of bring this up because when we say find gaps, we often forget that there can also be strengths that we do not want to weaken. These translate, when you do this, this will translate every surviving value into one or two observable behaviors. You need to take the value into action that can be seen and measured. You also need to name the anti-behaviors that will no longer fly. Put these results into a one-page culture charter, refresh values, concrete behaviors, breach examples, crowdsource these edits, right? I've done this twice, once at a public and once at a private, and both, ended up almost looking like bingo cards that people could keep on their desks, right? Became easy to say, how do I live this every single day? Because it wasn't in a PDF binder. It was on a one page that could be printed and sourced everywhere. Today, we could actually turn this into a digital value card, right? And we then embed it on the onboarding packets, performance check-in, even the project kickoffs. Practice makes culture stick. So run role play scenarios, a DEI dilemma, a client pressure, a missed SLA. And it's really important that individuals are signed role plays. In the programs that I teach, we don't say student to student feedback. We actually say that we're assigning either the CFO or the CHRO or the chief diversity officer, and they are giving and viewing the assignment or the work from that viewpoint. This allows you to rehearse calling out breaches and celebrating alignment. Use a resilience lens. Will this behavior still guide us if budgets shrink or leadership turns over? And then this actually takes you to that final shift from private convention to public accountability. Ask everyone to sign or voice a visible pledge. This could be in a town hall, on a digital board, wherever it may be, so that the values aren't just declared, they're owned. One more flow for you, and I want to reiterate what Chris said. These flows, yes, they're shown in a linear path, but they're all going to come back in on themselves, right? And so how do we actually embed this into a compliance and audit process? We know we're going to have additional audits coming at institutions. We already see them. And so whether that's the state legislatures, federal mandates, or internal stakeholders, in some ways, compliance isn't enough. We must go beyond technical compliance to embed cultural alignment. This framework helps integrate those cultural metrics into the compliance systems, so values don't just live in mission statements, but in assessment and daily practices. The framework is iterative, not just sequential. Okay, we're going to dive in. So heightened security has raised the bar on what compliance means, right? Talked about that. And so technical compliance alone won't cut it. The real test is whether culture shows up in dashboards, audit trails, right? That's where we see this iterative framework that embeds cultural alignment into every layer. First box, we start by adding cultural metrics to existing compliance dashboards. We need to be measuring not just the incident counts and the filing deadlines. We track the signals like inclusion statement, behavioral alignment, whether it's survey scores. The message becomes clear after a while. Culture is measurable and therefore audible. Next comes a self-audit, right? And this is almost functions like a moot cart for our own practices. We need to be working in teams, back to that coalition, that map their processes against state and federal requirements and against core values. Flagging gaps, where do they see silo decision-making that could actually trigger risk? This insight helps us then feed into pilot audits, right? These are mini on-site visits complete with role plays again, and see how values are modeled under pressure. Make it as real as possible. By standardizing these pilot audits across units, we turn culture from an abstract ideal into an observable behavior. When I was working with global student services, we would actually do surprise audits where we would activate our emergency systems or other pieces of our infrastructure, sometimes at 2 a.m. when that emergency truly could happen, right? And so because these auditors need a sharper lens, we then move into the training to spot culture in action, right? And here we teach our staff how to recognize inclusive language, equitable turn taking, or subtle clues of psychology safety that may never make it back into those policy binders. Finding from each pilot audit feedback should go into the training loop, ensuring that the system evolves as fast as the risks, right? And this is where we come into those 5 questions. 5 questions that I would say give to your auditors. Where did you see a recent decision shaped by a core value? What gaps between stated and lived behavior, not values, but behavior, can you identify? What are the biggest capacity constraints? This could be financial, human, right? Lay it down so you can actually define it. And how much time was invested in cultural learning on this topic? Go back and look at the trainings that you've done. And then last, what is one barrier that we can address in 30 days? Back to Chris is talking about those quick wins. We need to show quick wins to build momentum, right? And if you have these 5 questions, it turns every audit into a micro intervention, right? To make visible progress, we then move to storyboard. And I want to be clear, we're not talking about movie storyboards or other things that we may see, but simple mapping, say Title IX, right? What happens before, during, and after, highlighting where values surfaced or vanished. This we then take into those lessons, and we go back and we show a dashboard mock-up, updating it back to this is not just a linear process. And then finally, we continue to update the audit script, checklist, dashboard examples, as this will continue to change with us. In short, cultural work must be a visible and trackable process as any regulatory metric. By intertwining culture with our compliance data and our KPIs and revisiting the stages, we ensure our values appear in the same place as our risks, and this helps us close the gaps between what we claim we do and what we can prove, which we know is under increasing scrutiny. Chris, back to you.
Thanks, Eric. And I can't help but remembering what Peter Drucker observed when you mentioned that the first dividend of a resilient culture is really strategic effectiveness. And Drucker observed, of course, that culture eats strategy for lunch. So the importance of having a culture which is resilient, is adaptive, but enables the effective execution of strategy that are building on the values of the institution is really why we are here this morning. I'd like to suggest a term, cultural fitness, but within this theme of how do we sustain momentum, really what's the role of measuring and managing a process, a journey towards cultural resilience. And I use the term fitness because of the similarity that we have to physical fitness. You need to measure it, you need to stay on it, work at it. It helps to have a plan. And you are working towards generally certain kinds of goals through forming certain kinds of habits. So in cultural fitness, this idea of how we sustain momentum, also like to remind us that it's about measuring the metrics we either choose or develop. So we are measuring and understanding the right things. So we're going to have leading indicators, and we're going to have lagging indicators. The leading indicators will really help us understand how change ready are we. They're going to give us anticipatory insights. It comes from how are people participating? How are they feeling about it? So we would, the basic kind of tools of change readiness pulse surveys. How are we doing in our what in the Shine terminology, ritual participation? How many teams are doing weekly huddles? So these kinds of things tell us how the culture is proceeding. But we also need to know in a kind of a concrete way, the lagging indicators, which can be measured upon a milestone or an initiative's completion, their outcomes after the fact, right? What are our retention rates? What are the audit findings that we just talked about? How about engagement survey trends? These are all vitally important in order to manage the process of our journey. And it helps here, by the way, to build a real-time dashboard to enable process leaders to know where we are and to continue to help guide the group. And tools like Power BI or Google Data Studio, they are completely adequate to helping us build a culture dashboard so that we can access information in real time. And we may want to consider sharing perhaps all of that dashboard with our full teams, in the belief that transparency builds trust. And it also brings in many more sets of eyes that recognize even in the lagging indicators or the leading, recognize the need to course correct. Rhythms are very important. If we do something sporadically, irregular reinforcement, it has of course a certain impact in terms of behavior change. But in terms of cultural fitness, we are building we're building the kind of muscle memory in the group that comes from regular schedules and rhythms. Now, we need to vary the cadence or the sequencing, the duration to what we're trying to learn and track. So quarterly deep dives, not weekly deep dives. We'll be doing nothing other than measuring and observing. We won't be getting the implementation done. We won't be getting the benefits of our dividends. But the quarterly deep dives in cultural data are very important. An annual fitness or health report, cultural health report, but also simple things. Weekly email nudges, monthly updates that include 2 or 3 suggested actions. These are not all profound interventions. They are the maintenance effort that keeps momentum flowing. Some of the things that Eric mentioned earlier, update our tools that make planning easier and also implementation easier, like a digital checklist, and certainly the after action guide when you're finished an initiative or move to a phase, a structured guide for teams to reflect on their cultural alignment after it's completed. This feedback habit is really, really quite important because we do learn both from how we learn from the things we do well. We learn more from the things that don't turn out the way we hoped. And when you put those two ideas together with the underlying premise, you better measure it. Otherwise, it's not meaningful. We have lead into our next slide. So if you could go forward, Eric. I mentioned those, and we'll go one more step. And here we are. We all do learn from bruised shins. And one of the benefits of taking best practice sharing seriously is that we can learn from the bruised shins of others and then use them internally in our own institutions. So we wanted to identify, and we are identifying today, 6 common pitfalls on this journey and how we can really avoid them. The first and most significant, framing expectations is a real precondition for effective teamwork over time. Over-promising stability is catastrophic because we're minimizing the need for change, and we are creating a sense that this too shall pass. We need to, however, frame the change that's coming and the change that we make as iterative. We are going to do, learn, modify. Do, learn, modify. Not do and we're solved. It's one of the most common pitfalls is ignoring frontline voices, faculty, staff working with administrative staff working with students, buildings and grounds, people who are seeing the impact of these changes upfront and personal in their work. Their voices need to be heard, not somehow blended into a homogenized or sanitized take on the situation. So we need to embed frontline, unfiltered voices in our feedback loops. Critically important is to not treat culture as a side project. That's a real pitfall. I've already got more than enough work to do. I'm already worried about what's coming up next year. I will fit this in as I can. Not helpful. That is a form of culture, which is an impediment to response. So we need to align and make it clear, visibly clear, that culture is part of governance. It's part of compliance and it's part of reviews. The reviews, not just compliance reviews, performance reviews. Are we nurturing, advancing culture and cultural change? Sometimes when things go really well, we celebrate and we're done. And when things don't go really well, we place blame and we're done. Neither of those are productive in an iterative setting. So we need to run what is frequently called in emergency management and in military after action reviews. When we're done, how did we do? It's not enough to have that be the collection of impressions by participants. That is useful, but we need a protocol to follow at given stage in an initiative or at its conclusion, so that we have standardized insights that we're looking for, or I should say standardized analyses that allow us to draw unique insights from this experience. Building on the side project warning, in the money side of life, not allocating a percentage of budget for culture or placing it solely within the HR budget. Of course, a large share of it may well be in the HR budget because of all the other services that HR provides, but it needs to be part of every senior executive's budget because they need to be able to not only talk, they need to be able to walk that talk through their own work, their initiatives, their gatherings, their publications, all things that require financial investment. And the simplest of all is line item, right? There is a line item for culture in significant department budgets, significant executive budgets, and of course within HR. And finally, to go back to something that Eric has mentioned several times, I've mentioned several times, and as a former English major at the graduate level, I need to say, with Shakespeare, if he wanted you to pay attention, he told you at least 3 times. Anything less than 3 times, you were safe in forgetting. This is not a linear process. If you assume it is linear, then you are going to be experiencing unnecessary disruption because of continuing misalignment between your culture and these changes. So note to self, it's iterative. We will always be learning, doing again as we learn more. It's a process. Back to you, Eric, for some final thoughts.
Thanks, Chris. So high level, right? Culture is your strategic asset in disruption, right? We cannot prevent all these shifts from happening, but we can shape how your people respond. That's culture. Use a framework to systematize this, right? We know that having a framework helps, but the same framework will not work for each institution, right? And so they have to really be thinking about what will resonate within your institution. Leadership and compliance integration are non-negotiable. Culture will not stick without leaders modeling it, and this needs to scale to all of the leaders within your organization. Quick wins fuel momentum, metrics keep you on track, and you don't just have to overhaul your institution tomorrow. Start with small things, a town hall, shout outs, track what's working, and then keep momentum going, right? How do you actually follow through? What if you shared one idea from this presentation with a colleague, right? And so use proven tools that we've put together for you as a toolkit in the appendix. And just remember, culture isn't about perfection. It's about progress, visibility, and shared leadership. Through these seminars, we hope to give you tools to start taking those first steps. And just want to reinforce here what I mentioned, that there's an appendix with additional information for you. Some of the slides are the same, some are new, but you'll see information in greater detail and in different ways. Everyone who registered for the first webinar has automatically been registered for second, third, and fourth. And Chris and I look forward to seeing you. Session 2, Understanding Workplace Culture is the Foundation of Resilience. We talked about that, but we're going to go deeper into it. Session 3, Surviving Isn't Enough. How do we sustain a thriving workforce, especially when we know that well-being and other factors are the lowest they've ever been, especially in higher education. And in session 4, best practices that sustain progress and impact. This one will be in August, and looking at how we actually require structural reinforcement, clarity about risk, and coming back to our commitment to values. All of these have additional tools. And so Chris and I hope to see you back here actually on July 9th for session 2. Chris, any closing words?
Just thank you. Thank you for being with us during this time. And thank you, Eric, for this last 50 plus minutes of being able to share ideas with each other and with people who really matter to us. So thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you all.